Hello out there. Hello. How is everybody? Is everybody having a good day? I'm here with Gareth. Gareth.
Drum roll. Hello.
Drum roll, yes. I don't know about you though. I'm feeling a little tense. Maybe it's something in the environment, well, we're going to talk about tension in the environment and how it can make a scene more interesting. I should have had like something in the background, like an anvil hanging over my head, and that would kind of raise the tension, right? Actually, I am currently sitting on a trapdoor over a pool of venomous snakes. See, you just got a little more tense, right? we're going to talk about tricks like that to make scenes more interesting. Often I think the kind of scenes that you're concerned about, that you're like, oh, how can I ratchet up the tension, tend to be the scenes that are not exactly action sequences, although they can be. Often these are the scenes that are kind of those glue between scenes, like the conversation at dinner, which is going to set things in motion, or the planning session. And these are scenes where you can really lose an audience because you get there and you have to get it done because you have to put your chess pieces in place, but in the meanwhile the audience is like, okay, I get it, it's information, let's move on. And putting some tension in the setting can actually make the scene a lot more interesting, and it can actually transform the scene entirely. And we're going to talk about tips and tricks for that.
Yeah, it's a fun topic because I think it's one of these things that can often slip under the radar, but you're not really thinking too much about it because you get too caught up in the plot and the characters and theme and just the central stuff that you're trying to get out with this story, and you tend not to think too much about, well, how can actually manipulating the setting and playing with that add layers of conflict, add
Right.
extra tension, really help scenes, these plot points that you're trying to, we'll specifically talk about this as we go through some of the tips and examples today, but how can you use the setting to actually enhance the delivery of plot points that you otherwise may not have thought of?
No, exactly, right? Because as you're saying, yeah, you can get so wrapped up in, okay, what is the character most motivated at in this moment? I'm moving the story forward, the narrative is flowing well. But in that specific moment, in that specific scene, there's not a lot of tension. And so the characters maybe they're almost like kind of treading water a little bit in order to prepare for the next big thing. But that doesn't mean that in the meantime, you can create a little more tension for the audience, keep their interest, keep them hooked, and also just create a lot more richness to the situation, right? It can create another layer of interest. So let's go ahead and dive into some tips. And certainly, if you can think of tips on ways that the setting can make a scene more interesting, specifically when it comes to tension, just let us know. All right. So one thing I want to bring up is kind of the obvious one, which I call the ticking clock. This is where you're like, how do I make the scene more tense? Well, what if there's a bomb in the room and it's going to explode? It's kind of the obvious choice, right? Um, this is not always, though, quite as obvious as that. You can simply put in a device that makes the characters have to hurry up what they're doing. It could be as simple as we're going to lose control of this space after a certain amount of time, so this conversation gets sped up. It could be I only have a limited time to talk to you because I'm in prison and I only get a 2-minute phone call, right? There are ways that you can create a time limit on what is going on, and that immediately kind of gives an urgency to the scene that it wouldn't have otherwise. Do you ever try to use this, Gareth? I'm sure you have, right?
Yeah, I think that this is probably one of the easier ones when it comes to actually utilizing setting in this way as the
Yeah,
ticking clock, because
it's pretty
it
obvious.
keeps people confined. It's like the boat is sinking. We're on, the
Exactly.
setting is the boat. We're on it and it's sinking. There's a time limit. That can be like an oil rig is collapsing. Even oxygen is running out on the spaceship. All that
Hmm.
kind of thing. You're restricted to that setting, and it's factors of the setting that are actually the ticking clock. You're going to run out of time, and it's all going to be over. Disaster movies and things like that as well. Volcanoes, the volcano's going to erupt, and we have to get everybody out of here. Even something like Pompeii and that kind of stuff has the setting intrinsically connected to the time limit. So really good.
Speaking of setting raising tension, somebody's pointed out I'm wearing the shirt that made me a disembodied head last time. I know, but I've adjusted my settings, so that shouldn't be happening. But you could be tense about whether or not that's going to happen. See?
He's got his chroma keying on
See
point
what I,
today.
see what I did there. All right, let's Sorry about that. Let's talk about another way that setting is. That was kind of the obvious ticking clock. Let's go to ones that are maybe less obvious. Like, what about raising the claustrophobia level by simply putting the characters in a restrictive setting? So this is a setting where they're close to a character they don't want to be with, or their motion is limited, or things like that, which raise the tension because it minimizes the options that they can do in the scene.
Yeah, there are two. Combining claustrophobia and the ticking clock, I think is a really great setup in something like if anybody's seen the movie Buried with Ryan Reynolds, where he's literally
Yeah,
buried alive in a
that's
coffin. And
basically the whole premise, right?
yeah,
It's
that's it. The entire movie is him in a
yeah,
box.
yeah.
And what do you do? And there's so many other really great stories like that. For example, Cube, the sci-fi movie,
Mhm.
one like that, very claustrophobic, just falling into these restrictive rooms full of traps and puzzles. And there was one that I cannot remember I can't remember the title of it now, but there was a French film that's on Netflix now, which is a woman crawling through a series of vents. It's a sci-fi movie where she wakes up and is just crawling through vents trying to find a way out, and there's lots of traps and things in there as well. So yeah, you can really amp it up, and part of the thing of increasing the opportunities for conflict and of course raising tension through the roof as well with things that you never know what's going to happen in these kind of claustrophobic stories is because by the very nature of it, that confinement and that claustrophobia amps up the emotional state of the characters. So you're
Yeah.
unlocking the ability for them to act in extreme ways, which will lead to more conflict than would naturally occur.
Absolutely. And you can think about this in so many different ways. Sometimes this can simply be who's around in a scene, right? If somebody gets into an elevator and it's like a really tall building in New York or something, so it's going to take a little bit of time, and then the villain steps into the elevator, right? And then the person has to like kind of clam up and stop their conversation, and then the conversation continues. Just adding a beat like that will look at how much tension you added, right? Because you reminded the audience of the villain, and they had to like clam up, and you didn't take a lot of space on the page. But if you hadn't had that beat, you wouldn't have that undercurrent of urgency that all of a sudden the scene has.
Yeah, true. And I'm not sure if you have this as a separate header bullet point thing, but if you do, we'll skip it when we get there. Is rather than thinking strictly claustrophobic for specific scenes as well, think about it as the setting for your entire story. Would it be um, would you have more opportunities for conflict? Would the tension remain higher if you were to simply change the setting to something like a prison? Something very restrictive where these characters, these two who are, whether it's two or more, let's just say two for the sake of, protagonist, antagonist. If these two who are butting heads are literally confined together, they can't
Right.
get away from one another.
Yep.
If that's the case, well, whether they like it or not, conflict is inevitable. They're always going to be cycling back around and in each other's faces, and that changes can meet all sorts of things. Whether it is a prison, a spaceship, again, you can be
Yeah.
out in space on
Didn't
a ship.
we
You can't just walk out of it.
I
So
remember, didn't we have a story we were brainstorming and it was like two people in a horse costume robbing a bank and they were getting stuck with each other or something? I remember something like that.
well, yeah, that was
But
the crew. What if they absolutely hated each other and they're
right, yeah,
they're kind of stuck
exactly.
together?
Right, but
And
yeah, no, that's always fun. It's the buddy cop concept, right? It's like, oh, and now this partner will follow you around all the time. Well, that adds attention to all the scenes that wouldn't exist otherwise, right?
yeah, it's
Because
like they're handcuffed together or that kind of thing. They can't get away from each other. It's so restricted. But yeah, it extends to all sorts of things. Space colonies, you can't go outside. Post-apocalyptic again. Maybe you can't leave the base that everybody's in. It's like a bunker or something like that, and everybody's in this bunker. When you confine that space so much that again there is no safe place for you to retreat and kind of get your
yes.
head back together, it's just a powder keg,
Right.
waiting to go off.
Absolutely. Somebody said, "Will this still help if both tricks are used throughout the whole book?" Yeah, you can keep the tension high throughout a book. There is a skill to that, right? Because it's like when you dial up the tension and you hold it there, you do run the risk of burnout, but you don't have to. I can certainly think of works that do, and they just keep the tightening the screws and tightening the screws, and it gets worse and worse, and it works great. But you do need to be aware that that's what you're doing because there is a skill involved. And I will say, in general, those works do tend to be a lot shorter than other stories where the tension kind of comes and goes, or it slowly builds over time, or things like that. because it does get fatiguing for sure. All right, let's talk about fish out of water. Yes. So this is where you're tense because you deliberately put a character in a scene that is difficult for them to navigate, right, Gareth?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways you can approach this. The fish out of water approach basically is placing your character in a setting inside of which, as a person, and how they present and how they conduct themselves, they are totally incongruent with that setting, or they don't have the skills to navigate that kind of setting. Again, using the setting to help increase or provide opportunity, let's say, for greater conflict, is best thought about from my perspective, is best thought about in the sense of how can I put this character in such a delicate emotional state that they could break at any time, because
Right.
that's when conflicts are going to arise. Otherwise, if we're feeling quite comfortable, we're maybe going to keep things inside. We'll be like, I'll deal with that myself, because I'm not feeling particularly under pressure right now. However, the more you can increase that pressure constantly throughout your stories, the more they're on the verge of breaking and letting this stuff out, and that's when drama happens.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
with the fish out of water, you're thinking, for example, class differences. Somebody of an upper class background is dropped into a distinctly working class environment. Some reality TV plays with this, with things like Undercover Boss and all that kind of stuff, where they
Yeah.
put them in these situations and they're just like, whoa, it's like, is this real life? And like, yeah,
Mhm.
sadly it
Yeah.
is, or
Yeah.
vice versa. You could have somebody of a distinctly working class background put into the middle of a super posh dinner and doesn't know how to operate within that setting. So you have lots of opportunity for conflict.
Yeah.
And again, conflict could be comedic as well.
Mhm.
Something a setting like that. It's just because they don't really know how to work it. And the thing is, thinking about these opportunities is that the setting that this is happening in, it may not actually be absolutely vital to what that scene is supposed to be showing us in terms of the plot point, but making the right choice of, well, how can I put them in a situation where they might be a fish out of water, or it might be claustrophobic or anything like that, is helping you pile additional pressure on top of them to see how they react, to see how they break, and how much more interesting that is.
Yep. Somebody pointed out that they write memoirs, they can't invent settings, but these are good tips for aspects of setting I need to empathize or emphasize. I think is also point. Yeah, it's so true, right? Just because, let's say you are writing, historical fiction or something where you feel a little bit restricted on what you can do for the setting, right? That doesn't mean you can't bring up these elements, right? Certainly, you can think back. Let's say you are writing a memoir or you're writing a biography of somebody. You can think of what were the situations, like Gareth said, where they were stretched, where they were put into vulnerable emotional states, and what caused that, and kind of turn up the temperature on that, bring up the volume to bring that out, because then the audience is going to be more captivated in that moment. And I think that could be really helpful. That's actually something that can get neglected when you don't think you have the option of adjusting the setting, right? Because you can certainly adjust how you write about a setting, and you can bring up those elements. So.
Yeah, yeah. And settings, any kind of choice of setting. Well, not quite any, because I was going to say, if any story,
A
all of a
white
sudden,
room. No.
yeah, all of a sudden you decide that the next scene is going to take place in outer space when your story has been completely grounded until that point. It's not going to work. So,
Right.
don't be hyperbolic about the fact that it tends to
Yeah.
work everywhere. But, you are the master of the story. So if it
Yep.
makes sense, just it's depending on the context of your story itself, just to switch this setting, do it. Like, just think of somewhere else, because it doesn't need to. I think the first option that we always have in mind is usually the easiest. Is like, well, it's just going to be a normal background. There's sitting at a cafe or anything, and that's it. Because what the scene is actually about is this conversation. Think of somewhere
Yep.
more interesting. Where can you put them, for example, that they may be a fish out of water, and how does that work? How does it make everything more dynamic?
Yeah. And it can also do a lot more for the character, right? Because if let's say you had a wealthy person and they're interacting with the working class, well, that's going to tell you a little bit about them. Can they empathize? Can they not empathize? Things like that. And you can get all the same story elements, all those beats across. Let's say, the story element you need to get across is they're doing research on land development or something. It's kind of dry, but it's just something you have to do to set the pieces of motion. But by putting in those other elements, now we're getting character as well, right? And in the initial scene, we can also end up with a little bit of tension as they navigate this. And so it makes it a lot more interesting than if they're in a comfortable environment just learning information, which is going to be rather dull. Not going to work too well. All right, let's go on to culture shock. I'm assuming this is a character that finds themselves in a very off-putting sort of location.
Yeah, think about when I say culture shock. Think about the wider what you can do in terms of world building for a wider culture, perhaps that this character is a part of.
Mm.
So it's kind of adapted or an extension of the fish out of water, but not entirely because well, the fish out of water that relies on literally dropping the character who is an outsider into this existing different cultural space where they don't
Mhm.
really know how to navigate. But when we're talking culture shock, you can actually create your own set of culture markers for any given setting and have your characters clash with that. So perhaps they actually
Gotcha.
grow up in this place, but rebel against it. They change their minds. This
Mm.
is wrong. And this is thinking of things like, punishments for crimes. Maybe they are in this particular setting or this particular society way overboard or not enough. Um, the local attitudes that people have, that are ingrained in that society, whether people there kind of turn a blind eye to injustice and abuse when they see it, they're just turning their backs because I'm all right, Jack, that kind of thing. And you have the character actually rebel against that. The setting itself becomes alive in that regard. It's a lived-in world, and they are rebelling against that. And when they're doing that, conflict is available at every turn. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. For example, they simply have a moral crisis, and that changes everything when they see something happen. Or it could even be like a coming of age tale where someone is just reaching that age where everything around them is coming into stark focus, and they think this is wrong. This is not the society that we should be operating in, and they can react to that. So they become or they develop into a fish out of water,
Mm.
but it's not just dropping them in like you would a different character
Right.
in a different setting.
No, that makes sense. As somebody said, any dystopian future fantasy, yeah, a lot of these rely on that, where they
Yeah,
start to
yeah.
become at odds with the setting around them, and everything involved is a point of tension almost at that. It's because like everything. If you go to the extreme level, right, it's almost like everything is working against you, right? Because you're just so against everything that setting stands for, and yeah, that
Yeah, it's
can
like
obviously create a
comfortable
lot.
comfortable situations become less the norm
Right.
throughout, which makes for dynamic and interesting and compelling stories because there's always something going on. There always seems to be a problem. There's always
Hmm.
conflict, and that's really interesting. Could be, the dystopian stuff. I guess one of the most famous of this kind of ilk is the lottery. That
Hmm.
story of
Yep.
killing people.
Yep.
Things like that work really well with this.
Yeah. No. Sure. Yeah. And this is another one where somebody said, what if you do this throughout? Obviously, that is what a lot of dystopian rely on, right? Is just culture shock throughout, and what you will have commonly is the way they ratchet up the tension is that either the character gets more and more resolved against the environment around them, or the audience and the character learn more and more about the hideous truths underneath, right? So it's a way to not just because it kind of dials up to 11 from the beginning. I mean, look at something like the Hunger Games or 1984, right? It starts in such a horrible place, but it still is able to ratchet up further because we're learning more about how deep it goes, and the character is brought down into the depths of the system itself.
Yeah, sometimes the rot just runs deeper than you ever imagine.
Right. Or the resolve against it too, right? The
True. Yep.
character gets more and more resolved, which makes it more and more tense because they're more and more at odds with everything. So, all right. Uh, all right. I was just looking at some comments there. Challenging values. So this would be kind of similar to culture shock, but I'm guessing this is where the character is put in a situation in which their morality is challenged or a worldview or something like that, right?
Correct, and that's just in the background. So if you
Hmm.
imagine the element of culture shock is something constructed, that's built into your world building, so that's a much larger scale thing. This one is just a little simpler, a little more grounded. Is something you could think about is having certain conversations or these important plot events, things plot points that are raised actually happen inside of environments that directly challenge your main character's sensibilities or their vulnerabilities as well. So it could be a kind of moral standoff that they're stuck in, or they're put in a situation where they are made more vulnerable by what's going on around them. A couple of examples of this that I could think of would be if your main character was. I always use this example because I think a lot of the dialogue in this kind of example works really well as well. Let's say they're indebted to like this big mob boss. They owe them tons of money, and or somebody else did, and that's the plot. They're dragged into this world and indebted to a monster. Now, the easiest thing for that, if you have one of the initial conversations where they're brought in, they are summoned and taken in to talk to this mobster, you would likely think, well, I'm going to put them in a chair in his office or at the mobster's hideout, and he's going to be walking around and talking to them and saying, you owe me money, and blah blah blah. And okay, that's fine, but the setting isn't actually doing anything there. It's not operating in any distinct way. It's just a place for this conversation to happen in. But look for elements of your main character that define them, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities as well. And think about where this could take place that would actually kind of hit those vulnerabilities or trigger those vulnerabilities to up the idea of conflict and up the tension in the scene. For example, if your main character suffered from something like PTSD, and the mobster summons them, or they're brought in to speak to this mobster, and it's in one of these rec rooms, if you've ever heard of those, where you can hire out a room where you go in and it's filled with crockery and televisions and all sorts of stuff, and you're just given a baseball bat and you smash it all up. If this mobster was doing that, like, this person is A, brought into that room, B, they're being told, you're now a part of this world and you owe me money, and all that threat is coming on there. At the same time, there's the physical threat being shown of this person demonstrating what they will do if you don't pay them. And on another level, we all know, like, when you suffer greatly from PTSD, that character is going to be standing there trying to keep it together because of all the smashing and breaking and noise and everything happening there. It turns the whole situation into something much, much more effective, and again, dynamic. I'll always use that word, but it piles the pressure on to a huge degree. And what can your character do about that? The sense of conflict is raised because we have all this threat just built into a setup like that. And also the tension in the scene is huge because we're wondering, is this character going to break? What's going to happen? And it's going to be really bad if they do. And you're sitting there the whole time, clenching your fingers, white knuckled, just like, don't do it. Don't lose it. This is really going to be bad if you do. And it expands into all sorts of other situations. If your character is a bit of a prude or extremely against the idea of like sexual exploitation, you could have them forced into having an important conversation at a strip club or something like that. You just sat them right in places that they don't want to be in because the environment itself is putting pressure on them.
Right, and that can either be, you could make that directly involved. Like, I can imagine, like, it's a story that's like there's an animal activist and the villain is a hunter or something, and then they have to meet them out on the range or something and watch them shoot at animals while they have this conversation, and they can't really do anything about it because of the confinements of the situation at the time, right? They just have to kind of watch this. And like you said, you have that really tense conversation because what you're talking about is maybe not related to what's going on, but it's a demonstration of what the main character just hates about the antagonist, and they can't do anything about it, and they have to see it. And it's like, when are they going to snap? When is this going to happen? When are they going to go over the line, or whatever it is, right? And it can make it a lot more interesting. Or, let's say you could go another direction, and you can have the main character get put into a situation where they're really at odds with because it's not something they would normally approve of. And throughout the scene, well, they actually kind of change their mind about it, and they adjust, and that can give you a little bit of character growth. And it may not have to be directly involved in the story, but it tells you something about the kind of person they are, right? And it's a way to do multiple things at the same time.
Yeah, you get a lot of opportunity when you really think about it. And this is a simple one too. It's not going to the extent of world building when it comes to like
Nope.
creating a culture and all of that.
Right.
It's simply thinking about what you can do related directly to that character within the setting. Maybe they've got it could be kind of tangentially connected, but maybe they've got an anger management issue,
Right.
and you decide to put them in an environment where they're having to have this conversation with another character, and there's kids running around screaming just all
Hmm.
around them the whole time that conversation is going. They're closing their eyes, just like,
Yep.
oh, I'm gonna lose it, I'm gonna lose it. And
Yep.
if you're following along with that as an audience, you're just like, oh,
Hmm.
they're gonna lose it, and that creates a whole lot of tension in the scene, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, stories with characters with OCD like to play this a lot, right? They'll constantly put them in places where it gets messy or it's disorderly and stuff, just so you can watch the character, cringe and,
I just watch
and
them squirm. Yeah.
yeah, you just watch them squirm, and it just adds a layer of interest. It tells you something about the character. But yeah, there's so many different levels you can do with it that don't require quite the extremes we talked about. There's different levels. It just depends on what it is. I'm looking at some of the things. You're a CPA, and the client wants you to fudge with the tax figures, right? Yep. Uh,
It's
uh,
timely.
a vegan having to work in a tannery, yeah, exactly, right? Or having to go to one, or things like that.
Yeah, again, and
Yeah, and
this
that
it's
also does include
important.
it could include claustrophobia and other things, right? Yeah, you can
Same
layer
thing,
on
yeah.
these tensions.
Yeah, it
Lots
was
of different opportunities.
a vegan forced to have this big conversation at a slaughterhouse or a butcher's, where they're just standing there again trying to, their sensibilities are being assaulted while they're trying to have this important conversation. Like, it's all about pressure, and as the writer, just thinking about that, okay, how are they naturally going to react here? Because like I said earlier, when you are feeling comfortable, you tend to keep things in. But when you're starting to really get hit on a a personal, moral level, some things are likely to slip out of your mouth, or some behaviors that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise do, and that can spawn extra pieces of conflict. Because again, it's just like a vegan standing there trying to have this conversation while someone is just chopping meat, chopping up a lamb or something on the desk in
Yeah.
front of them. They're not going to be happy about it.
I like this. Argument's interesting. Actually, I'm going to take that. You could basically do everything we mentioned up to this point in a dinner scene, because you could have a ticking clock, because it could be like, you just need to impress my parents for one dinner. That's all it takes, and it'll work out. So then you have a ticking clock on how long it needs to be. You can have the claustrophobia, that they're kind of stuck there. You can have them represent a worldview that they really don't like, and it's challenging their values. So you can cake that all into one scene. And all of that going on in the background. It's one reason why those scenes tend to work pretty well. I like this. My main character doesn't believe sci-fi and horror is true literature and wins a lunch date with Gareth.
Oh, there'd be problems.
Yes, but it's true, right? These are the sort of things. This is where I often think of. It's not necessarily that well, think of the characters in a sense as a setting, in that who's in the scene is adding to your setting, right? By simply just including the addition of somebody there, it can really change the nuance of what is going on. Of course, they can literally do nothing; they can be part of the background. But if they're just looming over it, well, that's going to make a difference, even if
Yeah,
they're not playing an active role.
something like that really changes the dynamics. You see it a lot, and it's very subtle, subconscious in a way. But even going back to like prison dramas and things like that, when two people are sat in a room talking, whether or not there is a guard posted at that door changes the dynamics of the scene. Because as a reader, or if it's on television or anything like that, and as a viewer, you pick up on that, and it feels like a less safe box to be in, that room, because there is no authority figure actually present, and that authority figure doesn't need to speak, doesn't even need to be involved. Just the fact that they're there changes things.
All right. So this is a good question. Does the amount of conflict vary with genre? I would say sort of, but I would say it more varies with tone. It more varies with the way that you want the audience to kind of absorb the book, how tense you want them to be throughout, right? Because I can think of different examples of different genres where the tension is quite different, and like there's a lot more conflict in a story from this genre than another genre. I mean, there are some genres that are pretty rife with conflict. I would say horror is an example where I can't think of getting that low in conflict, because to make you uncomfortable and fearful, you know, which is at the base of it, you kind of need conflict, right? So that's probably one of the ones with the most, but I don't know, maybe Gareth would have other ideas.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it varies too much with genre, but one of these things is, of course, you know, we're writing stories. It's a creative field, storytelling, and that means that there is no, for example, well, there should be 15 conflict markers throughout any book, or really being specific about it, because that's
I
not the
know,
case.
that'd be
So
terrible.
I don't think any kind of conflict marker numbers would be tracked throughout various genres. It's mostly just how those conflicts are presented. So, you know, an action adventure is going to have lots of amped up action. We're going to have, you know, gunfights, car chases, and jumping out of planes, and all sorts of weird, crazy stuff that you wouldn't necessarily see in a horror novel.
Right.
You know, this is going to be presented completely differently.
Right. And I would say, you know, like tonally wise, there are fantasy books and certainly romance where the conflict tends to be rather minimal because they're more comfort type works where you're trying to kind of get involved and it's designed to not be super challenging to read in terms of it's more like let's just sit back and kind of enjoy something that's not too tense, right?
Sure.
But that doesn't mean they don't have conflict at all. Somebody said this, yes, even Hallmark movies have value challenges. Of course they do.
They do,
Yeah.
and you'll
Yeah.
mostly find those kind of things, whether it's kind of low key romance. You know, I don't want to call it, well, comfort food kind of stuff. Goes along with what was the example that was in my mind there, slice of life type stuff, you know,
Yeah.
where it's just kind of general drama.
Right.
And those things usually aren't too packed with conflict at every turn, you know, and everybody's uncomfortable all the time and all of that kind of thing. They're usually
Hmm.
pretty overt when conflict arises, and mostly in the end with the resolution, the whole story actually hinges around one major emotional conflict between the characters, especially in slice of life.
Hmm.
That's getting to the end of that is the dramatic point where the teenager actually loses their mind and opens up everything to their parents and say, "You don't care about me," and that all explodes, and that's it. They all find reconciliation after that. It's like that. That's
Hmm.
literally it. That's the core conflict exploding at the end of something like that, and that can be highly effective because they're human dramas, and we can empathize quite a lot with those. So some really good ones, but yeah, they're conflict filled nonetheless. I think any stories that really
Right.
don't have any inkling of conflict is not really going to be a story at the end of the day, because there's nothing to struggle
Kind of a
against.
series of sequences, right?
Yeah.
All right. Um, competing interests. Okay, so this is where what is going on in the setting is deliberately trying to undermine what the main character is trying to do. And this can make for tension. For example, imagine a situation where all the character wants to do is talk to the main character, but the setting is, well, they're on a boat and the boat is floating away, and so they have to like swim out to it, or maybe it goes and it comes in some way. You know, you see scenes like that where they're just getting bits and pieces because of what's going on in the setting, or different things like that. But that can obviously raise the tension. If you have something that's obstructing what the character wants to do, and it's like not letting them get done what they want to in the scene, it can obviously raise the tension, right? It's a little obstacle, and it's not an obstacle you're making a big deal about. It's not like when they overcome it, it like is major character growth. It's just a way to add a little bit of color, a little bit of shade to the scene, and create some tension. Make it not so easy for the character.
Yeah, I like that. It's the I think like the example you said there is so good, where it's you're stuck on a boat and it's going the wrong way,
Right.
but everybody else on that boat wants it to go that way because that's what they're
Right.
all wanting to do. So this character is stuck there, like, I need to get back. How do I get back? What's going on? Because you've got elements of the ticking clock there as well.
Hmm.
You're if you introduce something that they have to get back in time for, yet they're
Hmm.
stuck traveling in the other direction. It could be on an airplane or anything like that. You know, what can you do to play with that in terms of the setting? The setting is actually a vehicle that's keeping them away
Right.
from what they need to do.
Or let's say, you know, you're trying to get information from somebody and they're just really busy and people keep giving them work. You know, they're the high business mogul and you're trying to get a comment from them because there's some deep-rooted mystery going on, right? And then, you know, people keep throwing different stuff and the secretary comes in, stuff like that. You know, that's obviously going to raise the tension because the main character is just going to get very frustrated because all they want is one little piece of information and nothing is letting them get it done. And those scenes can be really fun to watch, you know, and you can do it. You can do it comedically too, of course, where you're making light of the fact that the world seems out to get the main character, which is often really fun to watch.
And
For sure.
one thing key to remember, I think, with a lot of these tips too, is think about it not just in terms of setting as the story as a whole, but scene by scene. So
Hmm.
this particular kind of thing, it doesn't mean that the entire story is them stuck on a boat and trying
Nope.
to figure out their way off. It's just one
Nope.
event that happens in the story
Hmm.
is that happens to be the thing that keeps them away. So,
Yep.
you know, for example, you need your character to be stalled for a bit
Hmm.
so that they miss out on this event. You know, there's many ways to do that. Just think about ways that are that have lots of dynamics happening in the scene, lots of interaction. So, for example, they could be stuck in an elevator that's going the wrong way, and they're starting to freak out, and other people in the elevator are getting a bit worried about that. Or maybe they hop in a taxi that ends up being a ride share and gets stuck in traffic and they need to turn around, but the other person is like, I need to get to the airport, so we're going to
Right.
mine first. And now
Yep.
they're arguing. And, you know, what can you do with that? It opens things up a bit, makes it a bit more fun.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a way to add some color. But yeah, there are almost complete stories based kind of on this. I would say Home Alone to some extent leans into this with the parents trying to get back, and there's just all these different things that are keeping them from
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
it. So you can definitely, it definitely can be stretched out. But like Garrett said, it doesn't have to be the main issue, right? Because it does tend to work better if it is that it's like a comedy, because then it's like, what could go wrong? The movie Gravity, though, is basically this. It's just everything seems to be out to get the main character, and it's something that actually people criticize about the movie sometimes. Is they're like, really, everything goes wrong, like really, you know? But but it does keep things interesting because it's just constantly.
Like they're called
That's the way it is.
disaster movies for a reason.
Yeah, but see, what's fun about Gravity is that it begins with the disaster, right? And then it's just like all the ramifications of it, and it just is this ripple effect, and then it's like everything goes wrong repeatedly over and over and over and over and over. It's fun. Um, all right. The wrath of the elements, leaning into that, right? What about when nature itself is at odds with what it is that the main characters are trying to do?
Yeah, this is literally just turn the setting itself into the antagonist, which kind of strings on from the likes of Gravity. Is
Hmm.
clearly there, and something like Andy Weir's The Martian. Of course, the environment is the antagonist as he's sort of struggling to survive and figure out a way to get off the planet. But you
Yeah.
can think of all sorts of things here, whether it's weather, the geography. You know, maybe it's really hard rock climbing and things like that. Speaking of rock climbing, I mean, there's that true story 127 hours about Aaron Ralston who got his arm stuck under a boulder and was stuck there for 127 hours before having to cut his own arm off with a penknife. And you know, that's crazy story, but it's again entirely him at the mercy of the elements. That was it. It was
Hmm.
nature itself stomped on him, and you know, thankfully he ended up getting out of it. But that was quite successfully adapted into obviously the book, which was his pseudo memoir, and the movie. I think it was Danny Boyle made the movie, and yeah, a very capable story in both sides because while the overall antagonist was him stuck there, is also himself because it was all about internal conflict as he's thinking back to his life and all the things that he could have done better. Um, but yeah, there's that geography, the general environment, like the Martian. You know, you can't step outside because you'll die. Is real easy. But the thing to remember when you have these things and you're amping up, whether it is extreme weather, whether it's really arduous terrain that we have to cross, and all of this, what you're doing is organically causing conflict to arise because of the stress, because of the
Hmm.
pressure, and the
Right.
attitudes that such pressure places on the characters. They're going to bicker more, they're going to argue more, things are going to explode in a dramatic sense because they're heightened emotions, they're going to let things slip. And I think the really great thing about this and thinking about it and what you how you can do this even just scene by scene is always thinking about, okay, well, I need the characters to talk about this thing, you know, this is the conflict that I'm going to bring up here. Now, what's the worst place to have this conversation? Where could
Right.
this take place where, you know, anyone who is completely you know, logically detached or whatever would turn around and go, man, this is not the time or place for this conversation. You know, this is not the time to do this. Do that.
Yeah. Right.
Just make it happen because it explodes everything in a dramatic sense.
Hmm.
You want these things to happen at the worst possible times. And there you go. It's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, but yeah, and to your point, this is something that can be essentially the main tension of the entire work, but you can use it not, on the level of the Martian, where really that's, like you said, it's the whole antagonist, but it can be the antagonist for the scene itself. It could be, and often I would say when you do things like that, uh, it often will make the character kind of get like a bigger version of themselves, and they'll use that skill against the actual antagonist later on. So it ends up being kind of like a placeholder antagonist for them to level up. So
Yeah,
I'm thinking of like, quest stories where, they're in the middle of a conversation and then a big storm arises, and through this storm they have to make quick decisions and kind of gain their heroic command of the situation, and maybe they lose somebody along the way, which helps them have to get over the sense of loss and cost and all of these things, right? And you mature a lot, and that's going to come into play when they reach the actual antagonist at the end of the story.
or
It's common.
the hobbits with their massive quads and rock hard glutes after traipsing 30,000 miles across New Zealand.
Well, maybe I should do that. Is that how you get that kind of body? If that's the case, I'm going to go to New Zealand. It's going to happen.
Well, that would only make sense, I guess, if like the final challenge when they got to Mount Doom was a long jump. Then success.
This is a good comment. Yes, Alien has a lot of these tension points because it's a highly tense story. You could find a lot of these elements for sure. Um, and
Yeah, all of it's just layered on.
Yeah, and I think that is also something to be said about something like a work like Alien or things like that. Can you watch? I mean, sure, yeah, we could do a vlog and I'll walk across New Zealand if that's what you want. I give the audience what they want. Now, but when it comes to Alien, or a work like that where the tension is just super high throughout the whole thing, I think what you'll find what artists will do is they'll kind of bring in a scene, and they'll kind of emphasize, okay, this is what we're going to think about the most in this scene is, we're going to really emphasize the claustrophobia, and then this scene we're going to really emphasize a culture shock and this sort of thing, and they weave it through, even though all of the elements are kind of a constant in the background. But I think it's to keep each scene from being too samey from each other, right? That they'll kind of bring up that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I need to walk barefoot. Well, now we have a lot more demands. You don't adjust your settings, so your head will float when you wear green, Daniel.
All right, I guess it's decided. Daniel Down Under, our travel show coming soon.
Yes. Yeah, Stephanie, I'm not going to go with that suggestion. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about irony. Yes. This is where you can make the scene tense because the audience knows something that the main character does not. This can work really well. It's the old, there's something dangling over the protagonist's head and they're not even aware of it, but we're aware of it, and it's only a matter of time. It's kind of like a ticking clock, but the ticking clock is something that the main character doesn't know. And then sometimes that can make the scene even tenser because you have two things to worry about. You have the thing that's about to explode on them and they don't realize it, and you're wondering when are they going to realize it, right? So you kind of have two bits of tension going on at the same time. These scenes can be really fun to read.
Yeah, a lot of these too, it can be useful. Sometimes a bit difficult without, if you're trying to stick to limited POVs, through lots of stories, it can be a little difficult to do this. Not entirely. You don't need to fall into completely omniscient for this kind of thing to work, especially if you're writing from multiple points of view.
Right.
I think one of the things that you can do is with the distinct characters, with different characters, whether that's, again, as for ease of use, say your antagonist and your protagonist. Whenever we see those characters alone, by themselves, especially throughout the first act, as we're kind of setting them up and getting to know them, they're in more or less a small selection of familiar environments. So we start to assign a sense of ownership of that environment to that character. Then one character invites the other to that environment. As soon as we enter that scene and there's a sense of power of who owns this area, well, we start to then automatically think, what are they going to do here? Like they have
Mhm.
more knowledge, they have more control, and that can be something to really think about in terms of where you present these scenes as well. Look back and think, have I established some environments like this, and drop the other one in it? Kind of, they're almost a fish out of water at that point. They just don't know it.
Yeah, a good example I could think of is in it's often done in comedies, right, where somebody is hidden something, and you see the scene and the person hides something, and then the next person comes in and they don't know the thing is there, and they do this whole roundabout, oh, isn't it a lovely day, and they go around, and those scenes can be really fun. Now you can take the same thing mechanically and it could be a more sinister surprise, and then the tension is higher. It's still tense a little bit if it's funny, because you're just kind of on edge wondering when it's going to get revealed, right? Just like you're somewhat tense when you're revealing a fun surprise or a gift or something. It's there's still something going on there. I don't know if tension's the right word. I would call it tension. But if it's sinister, then obviously you can certainly call it tension. And to Garrett's point, if you have multiple points of view, you can do it, because you can have the main character do the action, and then the next character comes in and they don't know. One of the best examples of this is it's one of the more obscure ones, but the Hitchcock movie Rope, where the two men kill somebody at the beginning and they hide the body, and you kind of spend almost all the movie trying to figure out when people are going to figure out that there's a dead body in the room, and it works really well.
Yeah, and you can work in that sense of dramatic irony into things like that too, based on what the characters believe. Previously, we have seen this other character, we've been with them while they planted something or hid something in that room. Then the other character who doesn't know it's there comes in later on, and it fully in the belief that this thing cannot be in that room. The opposite is true. We've got an element of dramatic irony there that is a little delicious, I think, for a lot of readers to just be like, yeah, you're completely wrong, and I know it, and you're going to learn, and I want to know how. So it becomes very fun.
Yeah. Well, somebody was like, what does this mean, ironic? Often people use ironic for words that don't mean exactly what they're saying. I'm talking about dramatic irony, where we know more than the character. However, that works too. So we're going to talk about that kind of irony. Sometimes you can create tension by simply what is going on doesn't make sense for the setting at all. And this is something, again, to talk about Alfred Hitchcock, he did a lot. Action sequences at like a carousel or things like that, because then the setting is at odds with what the plot is kind of demanding of it, right? And so it feels kind of strange and incongruous, which makes, to some degree, it can feel more realistic, because rather than it being the perfect place for this setting, for this scene to happen, it's not a place you would expect. And sometimes it can add a layer of theme, or there's all different ways you can play with it, but it certainly can add a little bit of tension to it as well.
Yeah, in the strictest sense, when you're talking that dramatic irony, it's basically incongruity to the max. Things that are completely unexpected. A drug deal in the middle of a police station, that kind of thing,
Right.
that you don't expect there, and it's just baked into it, is making it obviously more interesting, because this kind of thing is not supposed to happen here, and therefore it's more involving, it's more compelling when it is.
Yeah, somebody says it's kind of like fish out of water. It is kind of like fish out of water, except that I would say the difference is kind of like a bunch of people are in it. It's not like one person is kind of out of place. It's like literally what is occurring, the action is occurring, is out of place. Is kind of the difference, is what I would say. But yeah, very similar. We're kind of going around the same thing, just in different ways. All right, time frame. Thinking about when you are actually setting your story can make a difference. What'd you say about this, Gareth?
Yeah, it's a fun one. Again, it's not that I really ever write much period stuff, except for dipping into a bit of Western theming once now and again. But I think if you think about the timeline of when your story is set, could it be more interesting? Can you add more obstacles, more conflicts, if you actually set your story during certain historical periods? If the idea that comes to you initially is, okay, this story about these people, and this is what they're trying to achieve, and this is the core of the human conflict, and all of that, and that initial idea that came to you is modern day, it's just standard modern day. Well, would it be more fun or more interesting, again, more dramatic, to actually set it way in the past, perhaps, where you have removed a lot of possibilities for resolution to things. Like, we
Right.
don't have the same tools, we don't have all these technological advancements and everything. Taking the other side of that, if you wanted to flip that coin, would it be more interesting if you think speculatively, go way far to the future? You're talking kind of sci-fi levels where you actually open up additional avenues. Could that actually help
Mhm.
or hinder the characters as they're trying to reach these goals? Does it make it more interesting in terms of setting? Think about that, because sometimes you
Mhm.
might think, yeah, okay, well, this is a standard story about a family and this and this and this, but you know what? It's actually going to be more dynamic if I set it in the Wild West. With all of the problems and everything, they're ranchers, and
Right.
there's everything that they had to deal with back then that we don't have to deal with now. Could that just make for a more compelling story?
Yeah, this often can be something that we could transform the entire work, right? Because often, unless you're doing a time travel story, you can't just bounce around time periods. But you'll notice that a lot of fantasy is set in a specific time and place. And partly that's because, well, technology looks like magic to us. It's like the Arthur C. Clarke, science. Advanced technology is not much differentiated from magic, basically, is what he said, something to that effect. And the idea is that, well, by setting it back in a low technology society, the magic stands out. But the truth of the matter is, too, is the tension comes up. If you have to do certain things, it takes more ability to do it. It's longer journeys. It's not like in Lord of the Rings, they can just jump on a private jet and go somewhere. It makes a difference, the technology level and just the tension. And I think horror will do this a fair amount for the same reason, right? If you'll notice, like, the old trope is like, oh, our cell phones all of a sudden don't work, because you kind of have to limit what the characters can do. So sometimes, rather than play all those games, they just set it in the past, and that means the abilities of the characters to solve the issue are more limited, technologically speaking.
Yeah, so you don't have to answer these questions if you just said it in the 80s or the
Right.
70s. It's
Yeah.
way easier.
Yeah,
But
and it doesn't have to be back in the Wild West, right? To your point, right?
sure.
There's so many advancements now that make a difference. Being in a house in the woods in the 1970s is different than being in the house in 2022.
Yeah, and a lot of these, I mean, the same kind of story structure, the same general story type that you're coming up with could work easily transposed into different things. If it's like a military thriller, you've got a guy on a secret mission and he has to complete this. It's going to be very, very different and possibly more interesting if you set it in the Civil War era versus modern military. Again, the tools, the conditions, everything are so different that it just packs more opportunity for conflict in there. Not that you can't find it in modern day, of course, you could construct it anyway, but think about it. Does it kind of fire you up a little more and give you instantly more ideas for more extreme situations that you can introduce for these characters? Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. As somebody raised this, the heart condition that gets diagnosed in a child by a time traveling family, do they return to their time to get treatment for the child? This is actually something that was explored in the Outlander series. Oh, somebody said that. Yes, it's not my premise. It's the Outlander series. I was wondering. I was like, maybe you just had a simultaneous creation of the same idea, but yeah,
It
exactly.
happens. It happens.
Yeah, no, it does happen because it makes a lot of sense, right? As soon as you limit the abilities of the character, it makes the setting itself at odds with them. And certainly in a time travel story, you'll see this a lot where they'll bring up the fact, oh, now we're back here and we can't do X, and wouldn't that be helpful? And it's to ratchet up the tension because it shows you the limitations of the main characters. All right. Another thing to keep in mind is what I would call another layer, right? Something can literally be happening at the same time and it can raise the tension. So, and this could be something that the main character is either aware of or not. So, imagine the main character is on a dinner date. Well, meanwhile, in the background, the mob boss is kind of looming and he's plotting their murder. Now, you could say, well, how do you do that? Well, it depends on the way to write your book. Obviously, most of the time, you're not going to head hop. It's not going to be like a movie where you could do just a quick cut because that's going to be really take the person out the scene. However, if you set up, different points of view, what's going on with the main character, and then you have another character, and that they're both in the same time in the same place, and the main character notices what the other character is doing in the background. well, you have that knowledge of what is going on. And, you know, it could just add another layer of what is happening. You often will see this, in my opinion, with like, well, I don't know, maybe not often, but a place where I could see this being used is like kind of like a monster story where it's like, you know, that the monster's looming in the background and they're hearing sounds. It's like, you know what it is, they don't know what it is, but it's going to add tension to what's going on. Kind of gets back to the irony thing too.
Yeah, a couple of ways you can play with that too. That very much calls back to what I was saying about the setting up a sense of ownership, and you could quite literalize it here. What if that restaurant that they go to is actually owned by the mob boss? That's his restaurant. Now we can either know that and the character doesn't, or would it be more tense if the character does know that, but they can't get out of this meeting? They have to go to this dinner meeting at that restaurant, and when they get there and they're sitting there, they notice that mob boss is in the corner staring at them. You know, where does it go from there? So you build a lot of tension, just building up before we even get in there, and then you can expand into conflict when they want to leave. They got to get out.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, I brought up the another layer is because I just want you to think of this, you know, let's look with all the ideas together. It's basically like another layer, right? What adding these tension points is going to let you do is just bring more nuance to the scene. There's something else going on besides maybe what you just took at face value, something that stretches the character or creates an obstacle or something like that. This is a tool that you can use, and it can make scenes really pop in a way that they don't when you know, don't include these tense elements. So certainly look at it, no matter what the scene is, and see whether or not some of these tools can be helpful for you, because makes me want to go back and rethink some things. But you know. It's like, why didn't I do that? What a great idea.
I think a lot of these discussions necessarily will. Don't do it. If you finish the book, leave it. It's done. It's enough work. Use it on the next one.
What is it?
Although,
don't pull a special edition. You know, that's George Lucas's game.
You quite like this. The height of tension, Russian roulette.
That's true. That's kind of like another layer, right? Imagine while they're having this conversation, there is a tennis match going on in which the results of the tennis match matter in some way, right? So there's two things going on at the same time. You know, that sort of stuff can happen.
Yeah, it almost is. It just at the core of tension as a concept. You know, you're always fraught there. You're stuck thinking, when is it going to go off? And believing that it is. It may not, but you believe it will, and you just don't know when. You know, there you go. Tension and suspense.
All right. So thanks everybody for your comments throughout. I certainly had a lot of fun. I love these conversations because they always make me excited to want to get back to writing. So I certainly think you're going to be excited and you're going to get back to writing and maybe add a little bit of tension to your scene. So that'll be fun. We will be back here next Tuesday. We are going to the stars. Well, not necessarily. Not all sci-fi takes place in the stars, but we're going to be talking about science fiction. Particularly, I'm going to be talking about things to avoid because negativity sells. No, I'm just kidding. But we're going to talk about what it is that you can avoid because, you know, the last thing you want to do is embarrass yourself by making an easy to make mistake. So we're going to talk about some of the common mistakes that come up in sci-fi. So certainly come back. We're going to talk about that. Bring your comments. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell for more of these videos. Thank you very much, Gareth, for leading me through this exploration and tension. It was lots of fun.
You're welcome, as is everybody.
Yes. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you around AutoCrit. Bye, everybody.
Take care.